Alrighty, thanks for joining us today, everyone. We're here to talk about the QMSR final rule that the FDA has finally released. This has been something that the FDA has been getting some feedback on industry for the last couple of years, and they just released the final rule on Friday. So very exciting stuff. Happy to share the insight that Rook's gained in reviewing the new rule and comparing that to the current QSR as well as ISO 1345. So getting right into the presentation, we'll first start with an overview of Rook. So we are Rook Quality Systems, and we're a consulting firm dedicated to helping startup to mid-sized medical device companies develop and maintain effective and efficient quality systems. We have over a decade of working with Class 1 through 3 devices, SAMD, and IVDs in multiple different regulatory markets, including EU, Canada, Japan, Australia, US, as well as some smaller countries. We're definitely tailored to supporting companies in the very early stages of QMS and device creation, all the way through commercialization and post-market monitoring. And we have a team of over 20 qualified quality engineers and certified auditors, which are experts in FDA regulations, MedSap audits, ISO 1345 compliance, which is going to be very critical to the subject matter we're discussing today, as well as the EU MDR conformity and providing support during any sort of external audits or regulatory audits. We also leverage our best practices to help build the QMS so that clients can get their devices to market faster, implementing things that we've learned across hundreds of different audits and regulatory inspections and device clearances. So, yeah, getting right into the real stuff that we're getting into. For Rook, we do quality system design. So this is that initial QMS establishment. This is QMS remediation, updating the QMS if there's any new standards or regulations like we're discussing today. We also support design history file and technical file creation for those that have a device but haven't necessarily put the formal documentation together or maybe are missing some documents. As I mentioned on the last slide, we also support with audits, whether it's an internal audit that you need performed for your company or whether you need a consultant on site or on hand for any sort of FDA or ISO audits. We also support software validation efforts, whether that be device software, QMS software. We're engaged in design controls and risk management, similar to the DHF and technical file creation. We also support all different sorts of regulatory submissions, including Health Canada, EU MDR, notified body submissions, FDA 510Ks or PMAs. And we also perform quality system trainings, similar to the one we're doing today. So an outline of this webinar, we're going to start with a background for the QSR. We'll briefly discuss ISO 1345, and then we'll discuss what the QMSR is and when it goes into effect. We'll discuss the changes from the current QSR to the new QMSR. We'll give you some tips on how to prepare. We'll share some next steps, and we'll also discuss about how Rook can help your firm maintain compliance with the new rule, and then we'll end with a question and answer session. So as we're going through this PowerPoint, if there's any questions that pop up, feel free to drop those in the chat. Jacqueline will be taking note of those, and then we'll spend some time going through those at the end of the presentation. So starting with a little bit of background on the QSR. So the quality system regulation is 21 CFR Part 820. This is where FDA defines current good manufacturing practices for medical device manufacturers. And if you commercialize devices in the US, the QSR is required. It's not optional unless your device's FDA product code is listed by FDA as GMP exempt. So while ISO currently is optional, compliance is optional, as of today, QSR, and as it's been for the last 20 years, QSR is non-optional. So the QSR did enter into effect in 1978. It was heavily revised again in 1996. So we're well overdue for an update. We're almost 30 years into the current revision. And the 96 revision, it did aim to align the current good manufacturing process or practices with the ISO committee draft of ISO 1345. So this was ISO 1345 1996, and the QSR revision was actually published before 1345 1996 was published. So there is some foundational similarities between 1345 and the QSR, but since ISO's gone through two major revisions since then in 2003 and 2016, it's a little bit dated, and ISO typically has more details as well as additional processes to define when compared to the QSR. So ISO 1345 2016 is the current revision of the International Standard for Medical Device Quality Management Systems. And this is for medical device manufacturers at any stage in the device life cycle. So whether you're in product realization, just planning out your device, or whether you're on the market, ISO 1345 covers that within its scope. And ISO 1345 was designed and written to be used by companies involved in the design, production, installation, and servicing of medical devices. And it also provides the foundations for companies to establish QMS processes to meet regulatory requirements. So ISO 1345 is the foundation for most QMS requirements outside the US. Smaller countries typically require ISO 1345 certification, not just compliance, before you enter their markets. And within the EU, notified bodies are actually required to certify your QMS to 1345 before you can actually get a CE mark for your device. So the QMSR is the newly revised framework released by FDA, and it provides medical device companies with new QMS requirements to comply with. So QMSR versus QSR, the M stands for management, so it's now Quality Management System Regulation. It's going to supersede the current requirements within the QSR. So when the QMSR gets published, it'll still be 21 CFR Part 820, but Part 820, as we know it today, is going away. The QMSR is also the big thing with the QMSR is that it's establishing the requirement that the QMS has to be documented and comply with requirements of ISO 1345. So the FDA does provide additional requirements. So it's not just 1345 certification or compliance and you're good to go. There's additional requirements that you have to meet for UDI, which is in Part 830, medical device tracking, if it applies to your device, in Part 821, adverse event reporting, which is covered in Part 803, and corrections and removals, which are covered in Part 806. So none of these are new requirements. These are things that medical device manufacturers have had to do anyways. So the new QMSR is just going to explicitly point you to these different sections of 21 CFR. So the design control exemptions for Class 1 devices, or rather particular Class 1 devices, complaint servicing record requirements as far as what information you need to record on both of those, and then the device labeling and packaging requirements are maintained. So that's on top of 1345 compliance. You also have to make sure that these are covered. So the design control exemptions, complaint servicing records, and device labeling and packaging, in saying that those are maintained, that basically means that nothing is changing in regards to the types of records that you'll have to have for those, but rather they're just kind of taking the verbiage from the QSR and dropping it in the QMSR in addition to 1345. So this QMSR was published on February 2nd, last Friday, and it will go into effect 2 years from that date. So until February 2nd, 2026, the QSR is still the rule. We need to make sure that we're ready to transition to QMSR when we're there, but until then, we want to maintain compliance with the QSR. So what are the changes from QSR to QMSR? The biggest one is the ISO 1345 harmonization. So now this standard is much shorter. It doesn't have its own section on document controls, purchasing controls, design controls, etc. It's now just incorporating those by reference to 1345. So when the QMSR says you must maintain a quality management system in compliance with 1345, all those things are now covered by default. That they don't need to have it redundant within the QMSR. So again, this does require 1345 compliance. Although certification is not required, we would definitely recommend it. And the compliance, again, involves the same processes currently identified with QSR, but additional requirements. A couple of examples of these are 1345, and compared to the current 21 CFR 820, has additional requirements for the verification of purchased product, for customer property and analysis of data, and then corrective actions versus preventive actions. So for example, with requirements for verification of purchased product, there's requirements to evaluate that purchased product based on the supplier's risk, which is not necessarily an explicit requirement within the QSR. Customer property is defined, including customer data, while the current QSR doesn't address customer property. Analysis of data is also a big thing within ISO 1345, which is not explicitly covered within the QSR. And then one other change is corrective actions versus preventive actions. So under the QSR and under FDA as it stands today, CAPAs are a single process for corrective and preventive actions, while under ISO, they are two separate things, corrective actions and preventive actions. A couple other key terms are going to be changing. So device history file, that's a term that's found in 21 CFR today. The ISO term for that is design and development file, so just a semantics change there. The device master record, which is the DMR, is now being superseded by requirements for the medical device file and ISO, known as the MDF. Essentially, these capture the same things. Medical device file has a couple of different requirements as far as documenting intended use and instructions for use, as well as training requirements. And then the device history record, or the DHR, while the requirements for this are not going away, there's not a formal term under the QMSR or ISO 1345. So these batch and lot records are still going to need to be maintained to show that you're able to produce the device in accordance with the DMR or the medical device file, but there isn't a formal abbreviation for this anymore. So how do we prepare for all these changes? So if you're currently meeting FDA requirements, but you have not addressed ISO requirements, there is a little bit of work to do. So ISO 1345 is mostly aligned with the current QSR, which is Part 820, but it does have several clauses addressing requirements and processes that are not currently addressed by the QSR. Good example of this is quality manuals. Most companies will have a quality manual, even if they're not ISO 1345, but this is actually not an explicit requirement within the QSR. Under the QMSR, it will be. QMS planning and quality plans is another thing that's called out by ISO that isn't addressed directly within the QSR. While the QSR does outline a management review and the requirements for those, it doesn't really define the inputs and outputs like ISO does. ISO gives you an explicit list of what things you need to check for the management review and what the outputs of that should be. There's also clauses and sections related to internal communication. Training records now have requirements to have their verification of effectiveness, similar to how you would do the verification of effectiveness for a CAPA. Product realization is called out in addition to design and development. So product realization is kind of that brainstorming, early planning process. And another key point is that the product realization process in ISO ties into risk management. Customer-related processes that we discussed earlier also includes customer property, which also includes customer data. So if you're a software device and you have a cloud that keeps customer data, that is considered customer property. You'll have to make sure that you set up a procedure or a process to define how you handle that. We talked about the verification of purchase product being based on supplier evaluation results and being risk-based. So poorly performing suppliers may need to have higher sampling rates or controls over their receiving or over the receiving inspections you perform for them. Cleanliness of product is called out within ISO while not directly called out within the QSR. It might be kind of a given that it should be addressed, but it's not explicit while it is in ISO. ISO also has explicit sterilization requirements from particular requirements for sterile medical devices, validation of sterilization processes, validation of sterile barrier systems. So all these things are explicit while they're not under the QSR. ISO 1345 also covers feedback, which is more than just complaint handling. So you have good feedback, you have bad feedback, and you also have complaints, which is a subsect of the bad feedback. So making sure that you guys are updating your quality management system in order to capture all feedback and assess all feedback, and then analysis of data, which typically ties into management review, but also takes into account all of your QMS processes, your quality objectives, the feedback you've gathered, any sort of other post-market information you have available, and then tying that all together to report to management. So getting into some details on some of these items, as far as risk management, ISO 1345 definitely establishes a more risk-based approach to QMS requirements. So it actually explicitly states you must incorporate a risk-based approach to establishing the QMS. Many times this is done by looking at your QMS process charts and the flow of processes and assigning a risk class to each of those processes, or rather establishing controls for each process with different tiers of controls for different risk categories. So the risk-based approach is explicitly called out within the ISO 1345 standard for the following processes, being QMS software validation, training, product realization and design and development, purchasing, servicing, and calibration. So these procedures that are currently in place will need to be updated to make sure that a risk-based approach is being incorporated. Particularly for product realization and design and development, you're required to establish a risk management file for each device or device family that's subject to design controls. This is based off of the ISO standard 14971, which is risk management for medical devices. Current revision is 2019. And one key thing for the integration of risk management into the design and development process is making sure that the outputs of risk management, so any risk controls or any newly identified risk, are captured within your design and development records as design inputs or outputs. So the other procedures like training, design development will also need to be revised to incorporate the risk-based approach, making sure that you're incorporating ways to assess the risk as well as how to escalate certain items. A common way to do this for purchasing, for example, is assigning different risk classes for the supplier. So low, medium, high, for example. And then within your procedure, identifying for low risk suppliers, we take these actions to evaluate and assess them, and we reevaluate them on this frequency. For medium risk suppliers, we do these extra things and evaluate them more frequently. And then for high risk, we do all of this and evaluate them more frequently. So just making sure that you have the different tiers of risk and the different controls for each of those tiers within purchasing, as well as all of these other processes, is going to be critical to demonstrating to either an ISO auditor or an internal auditor or an eventual FDA inspector that you have in fact taken this risk-based approach. So with design controls, there's additional details on various aspects of design controls that will need to be updated from the QSR to meet 1345 requirements. So we talked about risk on the last slide. These risk management outputs have to be incorporated within your design inputs. Design verification also required to be planned and documented, keyword planned. So while design verification plans are definitely a valuable tool, they're not outright required under the current QSR. This is not the case for ISO or the new QMSR that'll take effect in about 2 years. Another thing is for the design verification, you have to make sure you're including statistical rationale and addressing device interfaces. So if your device is interfacing with a software system or another device or a non-device, you need to make sure that design verification addresses those interfaces explicitly. Design transfer is covered by the QSR, but the section for design transfer within 1345 also includes a requirement that design transfer is verified as suitable for manufacturing. So under the current QSR, it just states that you need to perform design transfer to change your design into manufacturing specifications. ISO adds a requirement to verify that once it's complete. And we discussed this a couple slides back, but design development file is the new term for device history file. I don't think anybody's going to beat you over the head if you call it a DHF, but the formal term under ISO and under the new QMSR is going to be design and development file. There's also specific requirements for product realization that need to be addressed to meet ISO 1345 and QMSR requirements. So product realization is something that is more like the beginning steps of your design and development. It's not explicitly called out within the QSR currently, while there's tons of information within 1345. So product realization, they talk about how you have to incorporate risk into product development and manufacturing phases. You have to establish quality objectives that are specific to the product. You have to identify specific verification, validation, monitoring, inspection, handling, storage, distribution, and traceability requirements for each product. And the biggest gap between 1345 and the current QSR is the incorporation of customer-related processes into product realization. This includes customer-stated requirements and even unstated requirements that would pertain to the customer that even if they don't state it, you know that you need to incorporate those requirements into your device to achieve its intended function or intended use. And these also include any sort of user trainings that will be provided, whether it's IFU training materials or whether it's you actually formally training and onboarding the user to your device. There's also the requirement to review product requirements prior to shipment to customer, essentially review of invoices. And then there's also the requirement to plan and document procedures for customer communication. So this is for communicating product information, taking orders, receiving feedback, which includes complaints, but is not limited solely to complaints, as well as advisory notices like corrections, removals, recalls, so on and so forth. A couple smaller things to cover. Training, we talked about how training requirements will need effectiveness verification per 1345. So similar to CAPAs, you're not verifying that the training took place, you're verifying that it's effective. So you'll be looking at things like, has this employee had any adverse impact on the device? Are there quizzes that we can use to verify the effectiveness of the training? So on and so forth. The medical device file is also known as the MDF, is going to be replacing the device master record or the DMR. So essentially the same thing with a couple of additional requirements, including providing a general description of the device. This is typically on the device label, but a little more detail within the MDF. The intended use and purpose, if you're 510K cleared, you already have this. It's just a matter of formally incorporating it within the MDF. And then also labeling, which includes IFU. So labels are already required for DMRs, but this extends it to all labeling, which would include instructions for use or any sort of other materials related to the device. And then specifications or procedures for packaging, storage, handling, and distribution. So not just through receipt and manufacturing, but after it's manufactured and packed and stored and handled and eventually distributed. So the MDF definitely captures the full chain of the product from raw material to in the hands of the user. Then purchasing has a couple of significant changes, including supplier reevaluation requirements. So currently under the QSR, you are required to evaluate your suppliers, but there's no strict framework for the reevaluation of these suppliers that changes under the ISO 1345 and QMSR updates. You're also required to take that risk-based approach to supplier controls, including that risk-based approach also applying to the verification of purchased product based on supplier evaluation results. So again, classifying your suppliers, low, medium, high, critical, non-critical, however you'd like to do it, making sure that the controls you put in place over those suppliers, such as requirements for you performing an audit on the supplier, requirements for certifications, requirements for anything as far as quality agreements, or records to be provided with each batch that they send to you, anything like that for the different risk classes, as well as incorporating those risk classes into your sampling plans for receiving inspections. So while FDA currently in the QSR identifies receiving inspection requirements, under ISO, that verification of purchased product has to, again, be risk-based. So looking at your suppliers, you're going to be sampling high-risk suppliers at higher rates than low-risk suppliers, as well as making sure that the purchasing data you maintain for the different classes of suppliers is proportional to the risk. ISO also takes a risk-based approach to outsourced processes, which includes written quality agreements. So under the QSR, there is verbiage as far as agreements to notify the manufacturer in case a supplier makes any change. Now this is extended to explicitly be towards all outsourced processes, and it says which will include written quality agreements. I believe the verbiage under the current QSR is a little open as far as where applicable or where possible. This says will include. Under nonconformances, there's a couple additional requirements. So under ISO, nonconforming product is split between pre and post-delivery detection. QSR does define some similar requirements to the nonconformity process identified in 1345, such as mentioning the disposition of nonconformances. The difference is ISO is going to actually explicitly tell you the different methods of disposition. So it's either eliminate the nonconformity, whether that's through rework or through destroying the product, precluding its use. So this could be a field removal, or again, removing the product from market or from the customer or point of use. And then use under concession. So a modified use, which basically means the nonconformance is not applicable or wouldn't have an impact under that modified use. So there is a requirement now to take action if nonconforming product is detected after delivery. This will likely be handled under your complaint handling process, but also needs to address the ISO 1345 nonconformance requirements. And then while both QSR and ISO address rework requirements, they are better defined in 1345, and these updates will be published under the QMSR. So currently under QSR, when we talk quality objectives, there is a requirement to establish objectives for the QMS. Under ISO, these objectives are expanded, and they are required to be established at relevant functions and levels and to be measurable and consistent with the quality policy. So not just establishing some high-level overall quality objectives, but making sure that you're looking at each of your quality processes and implementing quality objectives for each of those in the different functions, and also making sure that they are quantifiable, that you can actually measure these and assess, and also the contents, making sure that it's consistent with the quality policy. So lots to worry about there in comparison to the current requirements in the QSR, but it's really not so bad. These are typically reviewed at each management review under the analysis of data process within ISO 1345. And failure to meet these quality objectives, it's not the worst thing if you can't meet your objectives. Sometimes people get a little brave with setting their objectives. So not a problem if you don't meet them, but you do need to open a CAPA to address the issue. So if you're failing to meet these objectives, you need to open a CAPA and consider revising them, or look to see what went wrong and how to prevent the recurrence of that. So overall quality objectives are definitely an excellent way to trend your QMS and ensure that you are consistently improving your QMS across all different processes. So if you're not in the US right now and you have a 1345 compliant or certified quality management system and you're looking to enter the US, until the QMSR is in effect in 2 years, you'll still be under QSR regulations. But if you are looking at entering the market after the QMSR comes out, there are a couple of different requirements you have to implement within your QMS on top of 1345. These are the UDI requirements found in Part 830, device tracking requirements found in Part 821. Now, this is only for particular devices and devices that FDA has sent you a letter to request that you fulfill device tracking requirements, and not everyone will have to worry about this part. There is also adverse event reporting requirements found in Part 803, corrections and removals found in Part 806. There are particular requirements for complaint records as far as the information that you collect for those records. Currently, that's found in Part 820.198. it will transition to Part 820.35A. Same thing for servicing records currently under Part 820.200. This will transition to Part 820.35B under the QMSR. And this is on top of existing ISO requirements to complaint records and servicing records. So essentially you have to meet all of the ISO requirements for these and then go into the QMSR and make sure that you're addressing those as well. Device labeling and packaging controls is the last thing on this list. So this is currently in Part 820.120 and 130, and it'll transition to Part 820.45 under the QMSR. This is not new requirements for device labeling and packaging controls. They are just FDA maintaining their particular requirements in addition to the requirements found in 1345. So next we'll talk the next steps for this transition of the industry. So definitely recommend to purchase a copy of ISO 1345-2016 if you don't have one already. Familiarize yourself with the standard. Look at the different subsections of the standard and compare it to the subsections of the current QSR to get an understanding of what these different sections have in common and what the gaps are. Next step is going to be perform a gap analysis of your current QMS against 1345-2016. And then following that gap analysis, you'll want to implement remediations to establish your compliance with ISO 1345-2016. We definitely recommend certification. There hasn't been a lot of information shared by FDA as far as what quality system inspections are going to look like under the QMSR. They say that they're working on new inspection techniques and that they'll share those prior to implementation, but not much word on that. Would not be surprised if it's a similar approach to MedSap, and since they're so harmonized, if they find that manufacturers that are already 1345 certified are lower priority for their random inspection. So in addition to that, certification gives you peace of mind, right? You have a professional come in, certify your quality system. You know there's going to be no surprises during any sort of FDA inspections. You don't have to second guess your compliance. You know you have it if you have that cert. And how can Rook help with all of this? So we have a team of certified auditors that are well-versed in ISO 1345 and certified that can help perform the QMS gap analysis for you and let you know where the gaps are and what needs to be done to fix those. We can also perform more formal internal audits in accordance with ISO 1345, the current QSR, or the future QMSR. This can, even though it's outsourced, you can outsource internal audits, and that will count for your annual internal audit for the year. So if all hands are on deck for just managing the QMS and there's not a lot of resources for you to perform audits, Rook can definitely come in and support that process. And we can also support the ISO certification process. So we like to definitely gather different quotes for our clients and make sure that we're getting them the best quote for the price and the timeline they need. We can also support the ISO registrar contract establishment. So not just getting the quotes, but also leading that conversation and helping support that contract process. And then we can also support the audits, whether that's sitting in virtually or on site, or even leading stage 1 and stage 2 certification audits. This is something that we've done for dozens of different clients that we're well versed in. So we'd be happy to help you with this as well. So before we get into the Q&A, feel free to visit our website to learn more about our services and consulting team. That's rookqs.com. We frequently publish blogs and host webinars like this. So for insights on trending topics in the industry, visit rookqs.com/blog for some of that material. And then you also contact me directly at my email. That's chandler.thames@rookqs.com if you have any questions, comments, or if you'd like to schedule a meeting. So happy to support that in any way. So with that being said, I think we can probably break into any questions that anyone might have. I don't think I see any in the chat just yet. Yes, we'll be able to send the slide deck out following the webinar completion. So you'll get the slide deck as well as the recording after this. So we have a question from Sarah. Will FDA accept a QMSR aligned QMS before 2nd February 2026? Officially, no, but really, if you are a QMSR aligned QMS, you're going to be meeting both ISO 1345 requirements and the current requirements under the QSR. So transitioning sooner than later would not be the worst thing, but want to make sure that any sort of references to different clauses of Part 820 within your QMS are accurate to what's currently published. So for instance, we talked about some of the clauses for complaint and servicing records changing between QSR and QMSR. want to make sure that we're referring to the QSR clauses and requirements until the effective date. So in the interim, FDA audits and inspections are going to look exactly as they have looked. They're not going to hold you accountable for the QMSR. They're just going to follow their standard quality system inspection techniques, which are outlined in QSIT. So if you go to FDA website and look up QSIT, you can find essentially the work instructions that FDA provides to their inspectors to perform those quality system inspections. Alyssa asked if we are already ISO 13485 certified. Are there any changes we need to make to our QMS? It depends if you're already in the US or not. If you're already in the US and you are ISO certified, there's not really any changes you need to make until the rule is formally in effect and you need to update some clause references within your QMS. But 1345 covers the vast majority of the QMSR requirements. There are a couple other ones that we discussed earlier, such as complaint, servicing records, adverse event reporting, advisory notices such as corrections, removals, things like that will definitely need to be covered. But if you're already in the US, you should already have processes established for those. So we have a question: if an anonymous organization is already 1345 certified and follows the current QSR, do we need to make any QMS changes or just be informed of the changes? So if you're a manufacturer and you're already 1345 certified and you follow the current QSR, you're mostly going to be in compliant with the new system, but some of the verbiage has been updated. So you will need to make some QMS changes, like for instance, the DMR verbiage going away, the DHF verbiage going away. I mean, tying those to the ISO terms. So it's important to definitely be informed, but even if you're already ISO 1345 certified and follow current QSR, there will still need to be some changes. It's just the vast majority of them will be incorporation by ISO reference or just making sure that you're pointing to the right clauses within the new rule. So what is the difference for FDA corrections and removals reporting compared to 1345 requirements? So ISO doesn't explicitly define requirements for corrections and removals. They have a requirement that for advisory notices, you need to follow applicable regulatory requirements. And these advisory notices include corrections, removals, and recalls under FDA parts 806 and 810. So for those, you'll need to make sure that you're going through those requirements and documenting the essentially checklist that's provided of what sort of stuff needs to go on these different advisory notices when you document them. Durga asked, what is the case when we apply for a new 510K with FDA before 2nd Feb 2026? Will FDA accept them or suggest us to rework for QMSR? So FDA does not typically review your QMS for 510K. They review the design documentation, and after you receive device clearance under that 510K, you're required to meet FDA requirements for good manufacturing processes, which are found in 820. So if you receive a 510K clearance before the QMSR is in effect, you will need a QSR compliant quality system. If you receive that 510K after it's taken effect, you'll need the QMSR quality system. So Alan mentioned that currently the regulation does not apply to manufacturers of components or parts of finished devices, but such manufacturers are encouraged to use appropriate provisions of this regulation as guidance. Is this going to change? No, this is maintaining, this is maintained. So definitely need to assess to determine the risk and the impact of how your components or parts are supporting the finished medical device manufacturers' processes, but not something that you guys have to fully implement or even register with FDA. Now, there may be instances where your customer asks you to maintain compliance, so that's a little bit separate from a regulatory requirement, but I would not be surprised if customers moving forward are a little more intensive in asking for ISO certifications. Will FDA still expect a management representative to be officially appointed similar to Part 820.20B3? Answer is yes, there is a requirement to have a management representative within ISO 1345. And that's found in clause 552 under ISO. Can we still use the verbiage LHR or DHR? I don't think there's an issue with that, but what you will want to make sure is that you define those definitions and you make sure that you're also incorporating the definitions within ISO and explaining For instance, that DHR is the records you maintain to fulfill compliance with the production records clauses within ISO. So you can still use that verbiage if you like, just since it's not directly from the regulation anymore, I wouldn't take it as a given, and I would make sure that you're clearly defining the terms you're using if they're not directly from ISO or the QMSR. So how about the independent person in design review requirement of QSR? Is it relaxed? So design reviews are actually a little more strict under the QMSR. So under ISO, there's requirements that you engage personnel across all functions related to the design, as well as having that independent reviewer. So I believe the current QSR, just pulling that up real quick, it mentions that design review should include representatives of all functions concerned with the design stage being reviewed, as well as an individual that doesn't have direct responsibility. And within ISO 1345, I believe this is mostly unchanged. Just verifying real quick for you. So another requirement for design review within 1345 is not just performing the review, but identifying and proposing necessary actions, including specialist personnel. So slightly more requirements under the QMSR than under the current QSR. So Lillian noted, is it safe to say that since the effective date is Feb 2026, the FDA will not make a new Code of Federal Regulation book available until then? I think the plan is that they're going to update 21 CFR online, the e-copy on the effective date. Wouldn't be surprised if FDA makes materials available for the rule before it's actually formally in effect. I would just say make sure that you're checking the scope and the effective dates of those documents from FDA to make sure you're working off the most current version. Will the scope of FDA inspections change in the new QMSR? That's a question from Ken. Answer is yes. FDA has not defined what these changes are going to look like, but if you've ever sat through an ISO audit versus an FDA inspection, you know that they have two very different feels. In addition to that, FDA now in maintaining ISO harmonization for QMSs for medical device manufacturers, now they have different processes they have to check, right? So they used to, check distribution records. They didn't have to explicitly check that you have customer communication processes set up to handle order handling, contracts, any sort of feedback. So there's a couple of new processes that are going to have to be inspected within your QMS. So FDA is going to have to come up with guidelines on how to inspect those, as well as updating their inspectional techniques for their current processes to make sure that they're capturing the additional requirements found within ISO. Someone had a question, if we're currently implementing a new QMS, can we implement QMSR directly? And can we do that as of now? So the rule is not in effect. We're not necessarily in a transition period. It's just essentially a hold period. The rule has been published, but it's not effective for 2 years. So that way the industry has time to transition, but there hasn't been necessarily any transitional guidelines on what they would accept as far as QMSR versus QSR. So for now, until that effective date, the FDA is stating that we need to continue to be compliant with the QSR. That being said, implementing QMSR, if you do it correctly and you're tying very closely to the ISO clauses, you're going to be fine maintaining QMSR because you will in turn be compliant with both 1345 and the current Part 820 QSR. That being said, if you have like an appendix and a quality manual, for example, which shows the different clauses of Part 820 and how they correspond to your procedures, I would definitely recommend keeping that in line with the QSR for now. And then when the QMSR is finally published, or rather finally takes effect on February 2nd, 2026, that's when you would go through and kind of update those references within any sort of regulatory trace matrix. So someone has a question, is ISO 1345 due for revision, and what happens to the QMSR when it's revised? So I believe that ISO 1345 just went through panel review and there wasn't a revision that was deemed necessary. If we look at when ISO was first published in 96, it got updated again in 2003, so 7 years later. Then it got updated in 2016, or so 13 years later. We are now 8 years past the most recent revision, so there's definitely still some life left within ISO. As far as the QMSR, so the QMSR incorporates ISO by reference. So if you look at the final rule within the Federal Register that's currently published, you'll note that it doesn't just reference 1345, but rather a particular revision of 1345. Let me get that exact revision for you guys. the third edition published March 1st, 2016. So if ISO 1345 gets revised, we would just keep an eye on the QMSR. And if QMSR is still calling out third edition and ISO moves on to the fourth edition, then from an FDA perspective, you'd be bound to the third edition. That being said, with the harmonization efforts that have been made, wouldn't be surprised if FDA gets a little more agile with how they respond to ISO updates and ends up either just incorporating the new reference within the QMSR or providing guidance on how to meet that. So within the QMSR, so I think an important thing to point out that we haven't necessarily discussed in detail is if you go through the current Part 820, there is all these different subsections. So for example, you have quality system requirements, design controls, document controls, purchasing controls, ID and traceability, production process controls, acceptance activities, going on and on. Under the new quality management system regulation, you have requirements for a quality management system, control of records, and device labeling and packaging controls. So there's really only three. There's more sections in that, such as scopes, definitions, and incorporation by reference, which lists the actual ISO standard that they're incorporating within the QMSR. But as far as individual sections of the QMSR, it's a much lighter weight approach and really leans on ISO for the majority of its contents by pointing to ISO. Really, that big clause is stating that you must incorporate or you must implement and document a quality management system in accordance with 1345. So the Deneb asked, does the transition period start February 2nd, 2026, or is that when it will be published? So that's actually the effective date. So it's already published. I guess you could consider us to be in the transition period now. It's not a formal transition like under EU MDR. But I think that as of now, we're still under QSR. And when February 2nd, 2026 rolls around, that's when the QMSR will take effect and when the transition period will be over. So that is essentially the due date for your compliance with ISO 1345. Definitely appreciating all these questions. These are very good questions, so feel free to keep them coming. Lillian noted that they're interested in the topic of training effectiveness verification and wanted to know if Rook offers a webinar on this topic. It's definitely something that we can put together. I don't know if we have a current one on training effectiveness verification, but Rook's heavily involved in quality system training. We will interface with different clients, even if we aren't building out their QMS, to provide industry training to them and help demonstrate the effectiveness of the training through the records that we help prepare after that training. So definitely want to look into preparing a webinar for that. And if you need any other information, Lillian, on training effectiveness verification, feel free to reach out to me via email. So Patrick wanted to discuss the difference between top management versus management with executive responsibility. So top management is actually going to be removed under the QMSR. So that definition is being replaced with management with executive responsibility. Practically, there's not a whole lot of difference. This is just ISO and QMSR aligning and making sure that they're using the same terms to remove redundancy or confusion. Do we need to appoint a notified body for compliance with QMSR like we have for 1345? So notified body compliance is particular to EU MDR. So For notified bodies, if you want to get a CE mark in the EU, you have to not only submit your technical file and get your device information reviewed, but you also have to have your QMS certified to 13485. This is not a requirement under FDA. Compliance is non-optional, but certification is not necessarily required. So that is one difference between EU and FDA now that they both lean on 1345 for their foundation of quality system requirements. Again, FDA does not require you to go through a notified body or through a non-notified body ISO registrar for compliance, though we certainly recommend getting certified. And if you're certified already under a notified body, that's a 1345 QMS cert. So you should be good as far as the vast majority of the requirements within the new QMSR. Would definitely point you to the slide where we discussed the gaps as far as tying in UDI requirements, device tracking, complaint and servicing records, as well as a couple of other things. Speaking of trainingness, effectiveness verification, to what level of detail does 1345 require this verification? So this person stating that their organization verifies personnel are trained to procedures, but not aware of much more done beyond that to ensure employees are effectively following those procedures beyond retraining when NCs occur with root cause. So the training effectiveness verification is required to be risk-based, right? So if you have a production process and some steps are very high risk and some steps are very low risk, personnel only performing the low risk steps don't need to be as verified as the high risk personnel. That being said, a very common tool we use for training effectiveness verification is just quizzes. So if somebody does a SOP read through, providing them with a quiz to make sure that they didn't just read and understand it, but you have documentation that they effectively read and understood the training. But again, this is going to be risk-based, so it's going to definitely depend on what role those personnel are filling within your QMS, the potential for them to have an adverse effect on the product or the QMS if they didn't perform their job correctly, and other considerations like that. Another thing you can do is trend too. So if you have NC investigations that are able to determine if the NC was a result of human error, then you can trend that information and perform an analysis on that to show that our training is effective because we are below this NC rate, for example. So will FDA continue accepting MedSAP certs after QMSR effective date? Yes, they will. MedSAP is also heavily based off 1345 and includes particular requirements for the participating member states being US, Health Canada, or rather Canada, Japan, Australia, and I'm forgetting one off the top of my head, but those MedSAP certs are pretty much ISO 1345 certs with an additional review of those particular member state requirements for things like we talked about with FDA, like particular requirements in each nation for UDI, recalls, corrections, removals, complaint records, so on and so forth. So those MedSAP certs will still be good, but the MedSAP audit checklist is definitely going to be updated from the FDA side to incorporate the QMSR. So if a med device manufacturer is both QSR compliant and also 1345 certified, what is the immediate action needed from a med device manufacturer? If you're both QSR compliant and 1345 certified, there's no immediate action that you would need to take today. However, would definitely recommend going through the final rule as it's been published and making sure that you're at least identifying some sort of plan within your quality system on how you're going to transition. So which documents are affected? Which documents have old 21 CFR Part 820 references that need to be updated? Are there any regulatory tables that reference the 820 clauses that need to be updated? So I think a good immediate action would be to assess the impact on your quality system documentation. And even if you don't make the updates just yet, putting that plan together so you can come back to it closer to the effective date and make sure that the final transition of your QMS to the new requirements is as smooth as possible. So will accessibility to management review and internal audit information change under the QMSR? That is a very good question. So within the final rule, there is actually not the same verbiage that there used to be as far as what FDA is allowed to look at. So currently under the QSR, management review and internal audits are essentially exempt. FDA can look at your plans, but they can't look at the actual management review or internal audit. FDA is getting rid of these exceptions. So moving forward, FDA will be able to review your full management review and internal audits. Is it allowed to follow QMSR even when 1345 would be revised in the future? Yes. As of the effective date in 2026, it will be required. If 1345 is revised in the future, the FDA is going to assess this for the impact on the QMSR. But within the QMSR, there's a section on incorporation by reference, which lists the exact version of 1345. Reminder, ISO 1345 was published in 96 and updated again in 2003 and 2016. So should this be updated again, FDA will likely assess the QMSR for impact and make any necessary changes. If they decide not to make changes, you don't necessarily, from an FDA perspective, have to align with the new version of 1345 or the new revision right away. You'll need to follow the revision that is explicitly called out in the incorporations by reference section of the QMSR. So I saw a question about Brazil. So this is particular to FDA. These requirements don't apply to Brazilian device manufacturers unless they are looking to manufacture devices in Brazil for eventual commercialization within the US. So under those circumstances, you would be considered a foreign manufacturer. You'd be subject to ANVISA requirements for your operations in Brazil. You'd also be subject to FDA requirements in order to distribute your devices within the US. Still have a couple of minutes left if anybody has any further questions. Really good questions, by the way. It's looking like there's no additional questions. If any of you have questions pop up after you've been able to sit and kind of digest this information that we've shared today, feel free to reach out to me directly via email. Again, that email is chandler.thames@rookqs.com. Feel free to visit our website for additional information on our services and how we can help you guys. And if the QMSR seems intimidating or if anything seems unclear, again, just feel free to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns. Happy to schedule a meeting and walk you through the process and answer any questions, providing necessary clarifications. Awesome.
And
well, I hope you all.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Declan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, just a reminder, I am sending out the recording later this afternoon. And as Chandler said, if you have any further questions, just let either of us know. And thank you for attending today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your week.